A soft, haunting whisper echoed through the dimly lit room, the air heavy with secrets. Mrs. Ashford stood frozen in the doorway, clutching a letter that had appeared under her door, its seal a symbol of the society that had destroyed her life. "They're watching us, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They've come for me now, and they won't stop until they have everything. If you're as intrigued as we are, make sure to stay with us until the very end to uncover the chilling truth behind the mystery. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unsettling tales from the shadows. You won't want to miss what happens next." Chapter 1. The Mysterious Visitor. The fog that had settled over London was like a heavy shroud, winding through the narrow streets, twisting and twirling, with an almost eerie deliberation. The gas lamps, their light softened by the mist, cast an ethereal glow, and the city's familiar noise, horses' hooves clopping, the occasional shout from a passing vendor, seemed muffled, distant, as though London itself was holding its breath. Inside 221B Baker Street, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending a warm glow across the room. The familiar scent of tobacco and leather lingered in the air. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair, the back of his head resting against the worn upholstery, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against his chin. He had been deep in thought, the tip of his pipe just barely glowing, as he contemplated some obscure detail from his latest case. His mind, however, had not entirely left the world of his musings, and for a moment the rest of the room, his cluttered desk, the stack of letters waiting to be answered, the heavy curtains, seemed to vanish altogether. Dr. John Watson, his ever-faithful companion and friend, sat opposite him, absorbed in his own medical journals, though his sharp eyes occasionally lifted to observe his friend. The stillness of the room was interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the door. "Ah, Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes glinting with that unmistakable light of curiosity. "I sense that our evening is about to take a most interesting turn." Watson set down his journal, raising an eyebrow as he stood and crossed the room. He opened the door to reveal a woman standing in the threshold. She was draped in black, her face half covered by a veil. She appeared frail and pale, the darkness of her clothing contrasting sharply with the sharp whiteness of her complexion. Her eyes, though hidden behind the veil, seemed to glow with a mixture of fear and resolve, two emotions that immediately piqued Holmes's interest. "I beg your pardon, sir," the woman spoke, her voice soft yet laden with urgency. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice cool but inviting. He motioned for her to enter. "Come in, madam. You are most welcome to step inside and share what brings you to my door on such a dreary evening." She hesitated for a moment, glancing out into the foggy street as if checking to ensure she was not being followed. Then, with a quiet nod, she stepped inside. Holmes stood, and for the first time, the room seemed to shrink, as though the walls themselves leaned in with anticipation. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Ashford," she said, her words trembling slightly. "I am in desperate need of your help, Mr. Holmes. It is a matter of life and death, though it may already be too late." Holmes took his seat again, his piercing gaze fixed on her, his interest now fully piqued. Watson, who had stood by quietly, took the hint and seated himself beside Holmes, his expression expectant. "Please, Mrs. Ashford," Holmes said gently, his voice reassuring. "Tell us what weighs on your heart. We are here to listen, and we shall not be quick to judge." She took a slow breath, as though gathering the courage to speak, before her eyes lifted from the floor and locked with Holmes's penetrating gaze. "My husband, Arthur Ashford," she began, her voice steadying slightly, "was a man of wealth and good health, but just a few days ago, he died suddenly. His death came without warning, and there was no indication that he had been ill. The doctors were unable to explain it, and in their confusion, they suggested it was a natural cause, a stroke, perhaps. But I do not believe that. I feel there is something more to this than meets the eye, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together, his eyes never leaving hers. "You suspect foul play, then?" She nodded, her hand gripping the edge of her shawl, as though it were her only anchor to the present. "Yes, it was not just his sudden death, Mr. Holmes. In the days leading up to it, there were strange occurrences, objects that moved on their own, a shadowy figure that I could never quite catch a glimpse of, and, most disturbingly, a constant sense of dread in the house, as if something was lurking just beyond our reach, waiting." There was a pause, and for a moment all that could be heard was the crackling of the fire. Holmes remained perfectly still, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. Watson, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow, but Holmes's expression remained unwavering. "Tell me more, Mrs. Ashford," Holmes prompted gently, his voice coaxing yet soothing. "What exactly occurred in those final days? What was the atmosphere in your home like?" She exhaled slowly, her eyes clouding over with memories. "I felt as though I were living in a house full of secrets," she said softly. "My husband, once so alive with energy, grew withdrawn, secretive. He began locking himself in his study for hours on end. When I attempted to enter, he would simply tell me he was busy, though I never saw him working. And one night I heard a faint voice, almost like whispering, but no one was there." Holmes nodded slowly, processing the information, his mind already turning over possibilities. "Your instincts are sharp, Mrs. Ashford. I believe you are correct to trust your feelings about this situation. There is something amiss, something hidden." A shiver passed through the woman as she looked into Holmes's eyes, a silent plea for help in her gaze. "Please, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "I must know the truth." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, a sense of mystery settling over them like the fog outside. Holmes rose to his feet, his sharp eyes scanning the room, as if the answers were hidden in the very walls. Watson, his own curiosity piqued, followed his friend's lead. "I shall take the case, Mrs. Ashford," Holmes declared, his voice firm and filled with purpose. "We will uncover the truth behind your husband's death, and whatever shadows are cast upon your home, I promise you, we will bring them to light." As she left, Holmes remained standing, his eyes reflecting the fire's flickering light, deep in thought. Watson leaned toward him, his voice a low murmur. "Holmes, do you believe this woman? Is this a matter of superstition, or something more?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, his gaze unwavering. "That, Watson, is what we must uncover. But I sense we are dealing with more than a mere case of natural death. There is a darker force at play here, and it is one that will require all of my skills to unravel." And so, with the first seeds of suspicion planted, the stage was set for the mystery of the Hollow Widow to begin. Chapter 2. The Hollow Widow's Home. The next morning, the fog still clung to London like a persistent shadow, but inside the walls of 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere was warm and comforting. Holmes sat with his fingers steepled before him, his piercing eyes fixed on the small gas lamp that flickered beside him. His mind was far from idle. It was already working through the case at hand with characteristic precision, though his outward calm demeanor betrayed none of the storm raging inside. Dr. Watson, ever the loyal companion, had spent the morning reviewing his medical journals. But there was something in the air that day, something that had shifted in their latest visitor's plea. Watson had known Holmes long enough to recognize when his friend was deeply intrigued by a case, and the subtle glimmer in Holmes's eyes indicated this was one of those rare occasions where the mystery would demand all his talents. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice calm, yet filled with the quiet intensity that preceded one of his greatest deductions. "We must visit Mrs. Ashford at once." Watson closed his journal, sensing the inevitability of the invitation. "You believe there is more to this than meets the eye?" Holmes smiled, but it was a smile laced with the bittersweet realization of what was to come. "Indeed, my friend. Let us see what secrets her home holds." As they arrived at the Ashford residence, a large, imposing house on the outskirts of London, Holmes noted the subtle signs of neglect that clung to the facade. The paint on the door had begun to peel away, and the ivy that once graced the walls now sprawled untamed across the windows, blocking the daylight. The house seemed to sag, as though it were weighed down by some invisible burden, its very structure sagging with the secrets it held within. Mrs. Ashford greeted them at the door, her face still pale but composed, though there was a subtle tension in her movements that had not been present during her visit to Baker Street. She led them through the entrance hall, which was dimly lit despite the daylight outside. The grand staircase loomed before them, casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floor. Holmes couldn't help but notice how the echo of their footsteps seemed to linger in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "This is where it happened," Mrs. Ashford whispered as they reached the study, her voice tinged with sorrow. She opened the door slowly, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. The heavy curtains, drawn shut, gave the room an oppressive, claustrophobic feel, and the desk at the center of the room stood untouched, papers scattered in disarray, as though its occupant had been interrupted mid-task. Holmes stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a practiced gaze. He approached the desk, his fingers hovering above the cluttered surface, touching nothing, but absorbing every detail. He noted the broken quill, the ink spilled across an open ledger, and the faint scent of stale air that seemed to cling to the room. Mrs. Ashford stood by the door, her eyes fixed on the desk as though it were a source of her growing unease. "Arthur, my husband, spent many hours in here, but I don't believe it was just business he was involved in. I've found strange letters, notes written in an unfamiliar hand, and there was a strange feeling about this place, an oppressive, hollow kind of silence." Holmes nodded but said nothing, moving toward a set of bookshelves lining the far wall. He pulled down a few volumes, flicking through their pages with a quiet intensity, before finally turning to Watson with a faint frown. "Do you notice anything, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Watson moved toward the desk, his eyes narrowing as he took in the disarray of papers. It wasn't the state of the room that disturbed him. It was the unnatural stillness, the way the very atmosphere seemed to press against them, as though the walls were closing in. The quiet was oppressive, almost alive with a sense of hidden dread. "I must admit, Holmes," Watson said softly, "there is something unsettling about this place. But what of the rumors Mrs. Ashford mentioned? About a shadowy figure, or the voices she heard?" Holmes's eyes flicked toward the widow, who stood motionless by the door, her hands clasped tightly together. "What voices, Mrs. Ashford?" Holmes asked, his voice gentle yet probing. Her eyes flickered as if the question had reopened old wounds. "At night, I would hear them, sometimes faint whispers. Other times, it would feel as though someone was walking through the house, someone who was not there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but it was too real, too present." Holmes turned his attention to the shadows in the corners of the room, his mind processing the details. A figure in the house? A lingering presence. These were not the symptoms of a haunted home, but of something far more insidious. He stepped closer to the desk and picked up a letter that had been left carelessly among the scattered papers. It was a letter addressed to Arthur Ashford, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, and angular. He unfolded it, reading the words quickly, and then paused. "This letter is important, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "It's a threat, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Whoever wrote this wanted something from Mr. Ashford, and this is not merely a matter of business." The widow gasped softly as Holmes turned the letter toward her, allowing her to read the contents. Her hand trembled as she glanced over the words, but she did not speak. Holmes looked back at her, his expression softening. "Mrs. Ashford, I believe your husband was caught in a web much darker than you might have imagined. There are forces at play here, forces that are not of this world, at least not in the way we understand them. We must proceed carefully, but rest assured, we will get to the bottom of this." The widow nodded, her face drawn in sorrow, but her eyes held a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression now grave, as he pulled a small notepad from his coat and began jotting down the details. "We will begin by finding out who this letter was meant for. But I have no doubt, Watson, that our journey will lead us to places where reason and logic alone cannot guide us." The room, once heavy with dread, now seemed even quieter, as though something, or someone, was waiting, watching, just beyond the threshold. As they left the study, Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that the shadows in the corners of the room held secrets far deeper than they could yet understand. Chapter 3. The Locked Drawer. The day had turned to dusk when Holmes and Watson left the Ashford residence. The fog had deepened, curling through the streets like a living thing, muting the usual sounds of the city. Holmes seemed lost in thought, his usually sharp eyes distant, as though something in the case had begun to gnaw at him in ways that words could not express. Watson, ever the observer, noted the subtle tension in his friend's posture. Holmes was always calm, but today there was something different in his demeanor, an air of anticipation hanging around him like the fog. "Holmes," Watson said as they walked, his voice breaking the silence, "do you believe there is more to this case than meets the eye? You seem distant." Holmes glanced at Watson, his face unreadable. "There is much we have yet to uncover, Watson," he replied softly. Mrs. Ashford's husband was not just a victim of an illness or some accident. The truth is far more intricate, and it lies within the secrets of this house. They made their way back to Baker Street, and Holmes spent the evening reviewing his notes, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. Watson, sensing that his companion's mind was too wrapped up in the case to be distracted, retired to his room for the night. The next morning, Holmes was already awake before the dawn, a fresh resolve in his eyes. "Watson," he said, his voice carrying an air of finality, "we are going back to the Ashford residence today." As they arrived, the house seemed to loom larger than before, its once majestic presence now marred by a sense of desolation. Mrs. Ashford greeted them at the door, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice a mixture of sorrow and urgency, "I am glad you have returned, but there is something I must show you." Holmes followed her into the drawing room, his footsteps measured and deliberate, Watson close behind. Mrs. Ashford led them to a wooden desk at the far end of the room. It was a grand piece of furniture, dark and polished, its surface covered with scattered papers and the faint traces of dust. "This," Mrs. Ashford whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "is where Arthur spent his nights in the last weeks of his life. But there is something strange about this desk. It has a drawer, one that he never let me open. Even when I asked, he would grow uncomfortable and tell me it was private. I do not know what is inside, but I feel it is important." Holmes's sharp eyes took in the scene as he walked toward the desk, his fingers brushing over the edges of the wood with practiced precision. His eyes flickered to the drawer that Mrs. Ashford had pointed out, and he noticed immediately that it was locked. The lock was old-fashioned, but the key was nowhere to be seen. Holmes turned to Mrs. Ashford. "The key to this drawer. Did your husband keep it in a particular place?" She shook her head, her expression growing anxious. "No, I never saw it. I do not know where it is." Holmes stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the locked drawer. It was not an ordinary lock. The intricate design suggested something more than simple security. It seemed to hide something of value, something that its owner wanted to protect from prying eyes, something that had remained hidden for too long. "Watson," Holmes said softly, turning toward his companion, "I shall need your assistance. We are going to open this drawer." Holmes retrieved his lockpicks from his coat, his hands moving with swift precision. He worked in silence, the soft click of his tools, the only sound in the room. Mrs. Ashford stood by, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. The lock yielded after only a few moments, and Holmes opened the drawer slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside, there were a few papers, some faded letters, and a small ornate box wrapped in faded cloth. Holmes reached for the box with the careful touch of someone handling a delicate artifact, his brow furrowed as he unwrapped it. The box was small, intricately carved with symbols that were foreign to both Holmes and Watson. The surface was tarnished, the wood worn smooth by years of handling, but there was no mistaking its significance. This was no mere trinket. Holmes set the box on the desk and began inspecting it more closely. "This, Watson," he said with quiet certainty, "is important. There is something here, something that Arthur Ashford did not want to share with anyone, least of all his wife." He carefully opened the box. Inside, there was a small folded letter, yellowed with age. The paper was fragile, as though it had been tucked away for a long time, perhaps decades. Holmes unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words written in a hand that was sharp and deliberate. Not the elegant script of Ashford himself, but rather something darker, more urgent. Watson leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What does it say, Holmes?" Holmes read the letter aloud, his voice low and steady. "If you wish to keep your secret, you must obey. The price is steep, but failure will cost you more than your wealth. The past cannot be undone, Arthur. Beware the consequences. We will come for what is ours." The words hung in the air like a weight, their meaning sinking in slowly. Watson's face darkened, his brow furrowing as he turned to Holmes. This is not simply about money or business," Watson said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "This is something far more dangerous. It speaks of consequences." Holmes closed the letter slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as though to better understand its origins. "Yes, Watson," he murmured. "This letter is a threat, a warning. Whoever sent this has ties to Ashford's past, ties that we have yet to uncover. And it is clear now that his death was not the result of a simple illness or accident. It was deliberate." Mrs. Ashford stood motionless, her face pale as the reality of the situation began to take hold of her. "But who would want to harm my husband? What has he done to deserve this?" Holmes looked up from the box, his eyes dark with the weight of the mystery. "That, Mrs. Ashford, is exactly what we must find out." As Holmes and Watson left the room, the quiet of the house seemed even more oppressive. The fog outside had thickened, and the silence within the walls of the Ashford residence was all-encompassing. Holmes could feel the shadows pressing in, the whispers of the past seeming to grow louder with each passing minute. "Watson," Holmes said softly as they stepped out into the dim light of the street, "this case is far from over. We have uncovered only the surface of something far deeper, and I suspect we have only just begun to scrape at the truth." The suspense was palpable, the tension mounting with every step they took away from the house. Holmes could feel the puzzle pieces beginning to fall into place, but the answers were still elusive. Whatever forces were at work here, they were far more dangerous than he had first suspected, and the journey ahead promised only greater uncertainty. As the fog rolled in, the quiet sense of impending danger seemed to follow them, and Holmes knew that the hollow widow's tale was far from finished. Chapter 4. A Tragic Revelation. The air outside was thick with fog as Holmes and Watson made their way through the labyrinth of London streets. The investigation into the strange death of Arthur Ashford had taken a dark turn, and though Holmes remained outwardly calm, there was an undeniable tension in his posture. The discovery of the letter and the mysterious box had revealed a new layer to the case, one that seemed to grow deeper and more intricate with every passing moment. They returned to 221B Baker Street, where the fire in the hearth crackled softly, providing a rare warmth in the otherwise cool room. Holmes sat by the fire, his fingers steepled in front of him as he gazed into the flames, his mind racing. Watson, sensing that his companion was once again lost in thought, remained quiet, knowing well that any interruption would be met with a curt dismissal. "Holmes," Watson ventured after a time, "what do you make of it? The letter, the box. There's something far darker at play here than I first realized." Holmes did not immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on the dancing flames, his thoughts carefully ordered. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and calm, as if the weight of the revelation was too heavy to express fully. "Watson, I believe that Arthur Ashford's death was no accident. It was orchestrated. His past, a past filled with secrets, has now come to claim him." Watson frowned, his concern growing. "What do you mean, Holmes? What could be so dangerous in Ashford's past?" Holmes turned his gaze from the fire to meet Watson's eyes. "I believe Arthur Ashford was caught in a web of his own making. There are people involved here, people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. And I fear, Watson, that Mrs. Ashford is not only a widow, she may very well be a pawn in something much larger." The following day, Holmes and Watson returned to the Ashford residence. Mrs. Ashford greeted them at the door, her face as pale as ever, the shadows of her grief still etched into every line of her features. But there was something else now, an unspoken understanding in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that the truth, however painful, was now beyond her grasp. "I fear," Mrs. Ashford said softly as she led them into the drawing room, "that my husband was not the man I thought he was. I have found something, Mr. Holmes, something that I believe you must see." Holmes and Watson followed her into the study, the room now more oppressive than ever. The same heavy curtains were drawn, and the silence hung in the air like a weight, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Ashford walked toward the desk, where she had shown them the locked drawer the previous day. "Please," she whispered, "I don't know what to make of it, but it's the only thing I can find that might shed light on what truly happened." Holmes walked over to the desk, his eyes scanning the space as if searching for an invisible thread that would pull everything together. Mrs. Ashford hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for a small envelope that lay beside the drawer. "This letter," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "was found beneath the desk. It's not in Arthur's handwriting, but I think it's important." Holmes took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the paper as he turned it over. The handwriting was neat, precise, and yet there was a certain coldness to it, an absence of warmth, as though the person who had written it had no interest in human connection. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper, reading the words aloud to Watson and Mrs. Ashford. "The past cannot be erased. You will pay for your silence, Arthur. What we have shared will haunt you forever. I will come for what is mine." The words hung in the air, their meaning reverberating through the room. Watson's eyes widened as the implications of the message sank in. This sounds like a threat, Holmes. But who would have sent it? And what does it mean by what we have shared? Holmes set the letter down slowly, his gaze never leaving the page as his mind worked through the implications. "This letter, Watson, is the key to understanding the motive behind Ashford's death. The person who wrote it is someone from Ashford's past, someone who holds a great deal of power over him. And I suspect that this person or group of people has been manipulating Ashford for years." Mrs. Ashford stood by, her face pale and drawn, as the weight of the revelation settled over her. What does this mean for me?" she asked softly. "Am I in danger as well?" Holmes turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since they had arrived. "I cannot say for certain, Mrs. Ashford, but I believe you are in danger. Your husband's death was not an isolated event. It was a part of something much larger, and it is clear that those behind it will stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The next few days were a blur of activity as Holmes and Watson worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of the case. Holmes spent hours in the archives, combing through old records and documents, searching for any hint of Ashford's involvement in activities that could have led to his untimely death. Watson, though concerned for his friend, followed Holmes's lead, hoping that the relentless pursuit of truth would provide the answers they sought. Then, late one evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street with a grim expression on his face. He had found something, a document hidden in plain sight that connected Ashford's name to a secret society, one that had long since faded into obscurity, but whose members still operated in the shadows of London's underworld. "It all makes sense now," Holmes murmured, as Watson watched him with growing curiosity. Arthur Ashford was not merely a wealthy merchant. He was involved in a secret society, an organization that dealt in power, secrets, and influence. And it seems that his past, the one he tried so desperately to bury, has come back to haunt him. Holmes paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the final details. "But there is more, Watson. Ashford's death was not the result of an illness, as we first believed. It was a carefully orchestrated act, a punishment for his betrayal. And I fear that those behind it are not done yet." As Holmes sat back in his chair, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the room, he could not help but feel a sense of foreboding. The truth was within their grasp, but it was still shrouded in darkness, elusive and dangerous. Mrs. Ashford's world had shattered, and Holmes knew that the final chapter of this case would be one of reckoning. Whoever had orchestrated Arthur Ashford's death, whoever had manipulated him for their own gain, was still out there, watching, waiting. Holmes looked out the window, his gaze distant, his mind racing. The mystery was far from over, and the dangers that lay ahead were greater than anything he had yet encountered. "Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice steady despite the rising storm inside him. "We must proceed carefully. The truth is near, but there are those who will do anything to keep it hidden." Chapter 5. The Woman in the Shadows. The next morning, the fog seemed to have thickened in London, clinging to the city like a heavy veil, distorting the familiar streets and muffling the sounds of carriages and footsteps. The dense air made the city feel as though it were wrapped in an eternal twilight, with shadows lurking at every corner, just out of sight. It was the perfect atmosphere for a mystery, and Sherlock Holmes, as always, was unfazed by the gloom that clung to the city. He sat by the window, the faint glow of his pipe lighting the darkened room, his thoughts deep in the case of Arthur Ashford's mysterious death. "Holmes," Watson said, closing the medical journal he had been reading. "The past few days have been unsettling. You've uncovered so much, yet I still feel as if we are only scratching the surface. Do you think we're any closer to understanding what truly happened?" Holmes did not immediately respond. He simply looked at Watson, his piercing eyes focused, as if weighing each word carefully before speaking. "We are close, Watson," he said at last, his voice calm, but there was an underlying tension in his words. "But there is someone I believe we must find, who holds the final piece of this puzzle." Watson leaned forward. "Who?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A woman. Her name is Lucinda. She was once a part of Arthur Ashford's past, and I suspect she may be the key to understanding the forces that led to his death. It is time to find her. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson set off in search of Lucinda, their steps taking them through the winding, narrow streets of London, far from the opulence of the Ashford residence. The fog grew denser, wrapping around them like an unseen hand, but Holmes moved with his usual confidence, his mind already several steps ahead, considering every possible scenario. Lucinda, as Holmes had suspected, was not an easy person to find. She had vanished from public view long ago, leaving only whispers behind. Her name had been linked to Ashford in the past, but the details were scarce, and there were no records of her whereabouts in the present. As Holmes led the way, Watson could not help but wonder what kind of woman they were searching for. A lover? A former ally? Or someone far more dangerous? Holmes stopped suddenly in front of a shabby, inconspicuous building, tucked between two taller, more imposing structures. It was a modest shop, its windows curtained off, its door ajar just enough to allow a faint light to spill onto the street. The air here felt different, colder, heavier, almost as though it had been untouched for years. "This is it," Holmes said quietly, his gaze fixed on the door. "Lucinda's refuge. She has hidden herself here, away from the world. But I suspect she has been waiting for us." Inside, the atmosphere was strange, a curious blend of decay and neglect. The shop appeared to be an antique store, though its wares were disheveled and disorganized. Some items stacked haphazardly on the shelves, others scattered across the floor. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mingling with the mustiness of old wood and fabric. Holmes moved with a steady, measured pace, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something hidden, something that did not belong. Watson followed closely behind, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with the feeling that they were being watched. Then, from the shadows in the far corner of the room, a figure emerged. She was tall, with a presence that seemed to command attention, despite the soft, almost ethereal quality of her appearance. Her features were sharp, her eyes dark and unreadable, but there was something undeniably haunting about her. Her face was pale, her expression one of quiet resignation, as if she had long ago accepted her fate. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and steady, as though she had been expecting him. "I knew you would come. I knew you would find me eventually." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze never wavering. "Lucinda," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, as though he understood the weight of the encounter. "I believe you have something to tell me, something that will help us understand the true cause of Arthur Ashford's death." Lucinda's lips curled into a faint, almost melancholic smile. "Arthur," she murmured, her eyes distant. "He was never the man he appeared to be, Mr. Holmes. There were things about him, dark things, things that he tried to bury. But the past has a way of catching up with you." Watson, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward cautiously. "What do you mean? What did Ashford do? What is it that you know?" Lucinda's gaze flickered toward Watson, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to a small table near the back of the room and picked up an object that was hidden beneath a cloth. Holmes watched her closely, his instincts alert. "This," Lucinda said softly, her voice heavy with regret, "is the key to it all. The thing that Arthur tried to keep hidden. And the reason for his downfall." She uncovered the object, revealing a small, intricately carved box, just like the one they had found in Ashford's desk. But this box was different. It was older, more worn, and its symbols were more complex, more sinister. There was a faint glow to it, as though it held a secret that had been locked away for far too long. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the box's details. "Where did you get this, Lucinda? What is it?" Lucinda's eyes darkened, and her voice grew softer, as though she were recounting something painful. "It was a gift," she said, her gaze turning inward. "A gift from a man who had promised me power, a man who made me believe that I could control my own fate. But it came at a cost, Mr. Holmes, a terrible cost. I never realized just how dangerous this was until it was too late." Holmes's mind raced. He had seen objects like this before, symbols of power, of control, of manipulation. This was no ordinary trinket. It was a relic, something tied to an ancient order or society. And it was clear now that Ashford had been drawn into something much darker than anyone had imagined. "What happened, Lucinda?" Watson asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. "What did Arthur get involved in?" Lucinda's gaze flickered back to the box, her expression haunted. "Arthur thought he could escape it. He tried to leave, but the society, it does not let you go so easily. They came for him, Mr. Holmes, and when they couldn't get what they wanted, they made him pay the price. They killed him. And now, they will come for me too." A shiver ran down Watson's spine, and Holmes felt the weight of the situation settle on him like a heavy cloak. The case had taken a new, even more dangerous turn. This was no longer a simple matter of murder or betrayal. It was a tale of manipulation, power, and dark forces that stretched far beyond the reach of ordinary men. As they left the shop, the fog had thickened again, shrouding them in a near impenetrable darkness. Lucinda had given them the answers they needed, but the questions only seemed to multiply. What was this society that had ensnared Ashford? And why was Lucinda now a target? Holmes's eyes, always sharp, now glinted with an intensity that Watson recognized all too well. "The true danger is yet to come. Watson, we have learned much, but we have only uncovered the surface of this mystery. And there are those who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Watson felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The shadows were closing in, and the truth was more elusive than ever. Chapter 6. The Final Clue. The mist that clung to London seemed thicker than ever, as though the city itself was shrouded in an impenetrable fog, hiding the truth from those who sought it. As Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson walked along the fog-lined streets toward their next destination, the weight of the investigation pressed heavily on them. The case of Arthur Ashford's death had taken a darker, more dangerous turn, and though they had learned much, the final pieces of the puzzle were still elusive. Holmes's brow furrowed as he walked, his sharp mind racing through the tangled web of clues that had led them here. They had uncovered the existence of a secret society, and they now knew that Ashford's death had been no accident. It had been carefully orchestrated, a punishment for his betrayal of the dark forces he had once served. But the question remained: who were these people? And why had they chosen Ashford as their victim? Watson, sensing the growing tension in his friend, glanced at him with concern. "Holmes," he said softly, "what do you make of it all? Lucinda's revelations, the box. There's so much we still don't know." Holmes did not respond immediately. His eyes were fixed ahead, his mind seemingly miles away. After a moment, he turned to Watson, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "There is one final clue we must uncover, Watson, one that will lead us to the heart of this mystery, and it lies within the Ashford family's history." They arrived at the Ashford residence, the imposing house looming before them, its windows dark and watchful. Mrs. Ashford greeted them at the door, her face still pale, her expression weary from the burden of grief and the mounting pressure of the investigation. But there was something different in her eyes today. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe the realization that the truth was closer than ever. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said quietly, "I believe I may have found something that could help. It's not much, but it might be the missing piece." Holmes's eyes lit up, and he followed Mrs. Ashford into the drawing room, where she had placed a small, weathered box on the table. The box was old, its surface scratched and worn from years of handling, but there was something undeniably important about it. Holmes examined it closely, his fingers tracing the edges with great care. "This box," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice trembling slightly, "was hidden in Arthur's study. I didn't know about it until I found it while going through his things after his death. It was locked, but I managed to open it. Inside, I found these letters." Holmes picked up the letters one by one, scanning them with his usual sharp eye. The handwriting was elegant, but there was something almost unsettling about the way the words were written. An urgency, a desperation that seemed to leap off the page. "These letters," Holmes said, his voice tinged with quiet excitement, "are from Arthur Ashford himself, but they are not addressed to his wife or to any business associates. They are addressed to someone else, someone he feared." He unfolded one of the letters and began to read aloud. "The time is near. I cannot escape the past, no matter how far I run. They are coming for me, and there is no place left to hide. I have made my peace with the consequences of my actions, but I am not ready to face them. The price for silence is steep, and I fear I will never be free of the shadows that loom over me." Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as he considered the contents of the letter. Watson, who had been listening intently, stepped forward, his face pale. "What does it mean, Holmes? Who is he referring to?" Holmes folded the letter slowly, his gaze turning to Mrs. Ashford. "Your husband's past, Mrs. Ashford, is more complex than you could have ever imagined. These letters reveal that Arthur was involved in something much darker than anyone realized. Something that, I fear, has now come back to claim him." Holmes and Watson spent the next few hours carefully examining the rest of the letters, each one revealing more about Arthur Ashford's past, the secrets he had kept hidden, and the terrible price he had paid for them. It became clear that Ashford had been part of a dangerous society, a society that had promised him power in exchange for his loyalty, but one that had taken everything from him, including his life. As they finished reading, Holmes sat back in his chair, his mind working through the final pieces of the puzzle. "Watson," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we are close now. The society that Ashford was involved in, the one he betrayed, is not done with him, and it will not rest until it has what it wants." Watson's face darkened as he considered the implications. "So, you believe they're still watching? Still hunting for something?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. And it's not just Arthur Ashford they're after. It's his legacy, his wealth, and the secrets he left behind. But there is one final thing we must do. One last step before we can unmask those responsible for his death. As night fell, Holmes and Watson made their way to the final location, the one place where they might find the answers they sought. The fog had thickened, blanketing the streets in a ghostly silence. The city felt like a place out of time, its usual noise swallowed by the mist, leaving only the sound of their footsteps as they approached an old, dilapidated building on the outskirts of London. "This," Holmes murmured, "is where it all began." The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its door rusted with age. Holmes approached the entrance, his fingers lightly brushing against the cracked wood. Watson looked at him, a sense of foreboding settling over him. "You think the society is here?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Holmes nodded. "I have no doubt. The final clue, Watson, lies within these walls." The door creaked open with a low, mournful groan, revealing a darkened interior. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was nearly suffocating. Holmes stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, his senses alert. He moved forward with purpose, his every step measured, as though he knew exactly what he was looking for. At the far end of the room, Holmes stopped. There, lying on a wooden table, was a small, ornate chest, one that seemed strangely familiar. He approached it slowly, his heart beating faster with each step. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "this is it. This is the final piece." Watson stepped forward, his eyes widening as he saw the chest. It was identical to the one they had found in Ashford's study, the one that had contained the hidden letters. But this one was different. It was sealed with a symbol, an emblem that none of them had seen before, but one that was unmistakably tied to the secret society Ashford had betrayed. Holmes moved to open the chest, his hands steady despite the mounting tension. As the lid creaked open, the contents were revealed. Papers, letters, and a strange, glowing artifact that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. "This," Holmes said, his voice low, "is the key to understanding everything. These papers, these letters, they hold the final clue, and they will lead us directly to those responsible for Ashford's death." As Holmes and Watson stood in the dim light of the abandoned building, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The mystery of Arthur Ashford's death had unraveled, revealing a complex web of betrayal, secrets, and power that stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. But as Holmes closed the chest and turned to Watson, he could not shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. The shadows that had once claimed Ashford were still out there, watching, waiting. And now, it was their turn to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 7. A Desperate Pursuit. The fog had thickened, wrapping the streets of London in a heavy, almost suffocating blanket of silence. Even the usual bustle of the city seemed muted under the weight of the mist, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sherlock Holmes walked with purpose, his steps steady and sure as ever. Yet there was an edge to his demeanor that Watson had not seen before. The puzzle they had been unraveling for weeks had finally led them here, to this final confrontation with the shadowy figures that had been pulling the strings all along. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, his voice filled with an unspoken concern. "What do you think we'll find in the building tonight? This place? It feels different. More dangerous, somehow. Holmes didn't immediately reply, his eyes fixed on the fog ahead. After a few moments, he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I believe we are about to come face to face with those responsible for Arthur Ashford's death. Watson. The society that controlled him, the ones who orchestrated his murder, have made a grave mistake by letting us get this far. They'll do everything in their power to stop us now." Watson's eyes narrowed as he considered Holmes's words. "Do you think they'll come for us tonight?" Holmes turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "They've been watching us for weeks. It's only a matter of time before they make their move. But I'm prepared, Watson. We must uncover the truth, and we must do so quickly." They arrived at their destination, an abandoned warehouse near the docks, its once sturdy structure now crumbling with age. The fog pressed against the windows, blocking out the faint glow of street lamps that struggled to shine through the mist. The building stood in eerie silence, its decaying walls offering no comfort, no warmth, just the cold, empty space of forgotten memories. Holmes approached the entrance with his usual quiet confidence, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as though searching for something, someone waiting for them. The heavy door creaked open as he pushed it, the sound echoing eerily through the emptiness. Inside, the air was damp and still, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. Holmes moved with purpose, his every step measured, his eyes alert for any sign of movement. Watson, who had become accustomed to Holmes's ability to detect even the slightest disturbance, followed closely behind, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane. "This is where they've been hiding, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low. "The society that claimed Ashford's life, the ones who have been pulling the strings. They are here, somewhere. We must find them before they disappear again." As they ventured deeper into the warehouse, a strange feeling began to settle over them. The silence, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps, was oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift and change, moving in ways that defied logic, as though they were more than mere darkness. They were alive, watching, waiting. Then Holmes stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "Look there, Watson," he said quietly, pointing to a small, dimly lit corner of the room. Watson followed his gaze and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, cloaked in black, his face hidden beneath a hood. He stood motionless, as if he had been waiting for them. Holmes didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Step into the light," Holmes ordered. "We know who you are, and we know what you've done." The figure did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, revealing his face, a face that was both familiar and unsettling. Watson's breath caught in his throat as the man's features came into view. It was someone they had encountered before, someone who had been lurking in the background of the investigation, his presence always just out of reach. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice smooth and measured, almost pleasant. But there was an underlying menace in it that sent a chill down Watson's spine. "I see you've finally pieced it all together." Holmes's gaze was unwavering, his expression a mask of calm. "You are the one who orchestrated Arthur Ashford's death. You and your society. I have known it all along, but now you will face the consequences." The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile that made Watson's skin crawl. "Consequences," he repeated, his voice tinged with amusement. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? You think you've uncovered the truth? I'm afraid you're mistaken." Holmes took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not fooling anyone. You can't hide forever. Your actions have consequences, and tonight we will see them come to fruition." At that moment, a sudden noise broke the silence, a loud creak followed by the sound of footsteps behind them. Holmes's eyes darted to the source, his mind working quickly. He raised his hand, signaling Watson to stay alert. From the shadows emerged several more figures, cloaked in black, their faces hidden beneath masks. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their presence like a dark storm gathering in the distance. The man in front of Holmes took a step back, his smile widening. "I see you've brought company," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But it won't matter. You are too late, Mr. Holmes. The society has already won." Holmes's eyes flicked toward Watson, his mind racing. "They're trying to trap us, Watson. We need to be careful, but I won't let them get away with it." In an instant, Holmes's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the calm, calculating detective. He was a man on a mission, determined to see this through to the end. He turned to face the cloaked figures, his voice firm and commanding. "This ends tonight," he declared. Without warning, the air seemed to crackle with tension. The figures in the shadows began to move toward them, their steps deliberate, as though they were closing in for the kill. Watson felt his heart race, the reality of the situation settling in. Their lives were now at risk, and the game they had been playing for weeks had just turned deadly. Holmes and Watson fought back with swift precision. Holmes's mind was a whirlwind of calculations, each move thought out before it happened. His cane was a blur of motion, deflecting blows and striking with precision, while Watson, ever loyal and determined, used his medical training to disable their opponents with quick, efficient moves. The battle was brief but intense, the sound of struggling bodies echoing through the warehouse. One by one, the cloaked figures were subdued, but the leader, the man who had been pulling the strings, remained a step ahead, his movements precise and unnervingly controlled. He stepped back, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You cannot defeat us, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and cold. "The society is too powerful. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the man with deadly intent. "I'm not finished with you yet. You and your society will be brought to justice." As the final figure was captured and the immediate danger had passed, Holmes and Watson stood in the middle of the warehouse, the weight of what they had just encountered pressing heavily on them. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? The society that had claimed Ashford's life was far from finished, and now they knew that the fight was just beginning. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression one of grim determination. "The society will not rest until they have everything they want. But tonight, Watson, we have taken the first step toward unraveling their entire operation, and I will not stop until they are all brought to justice." Chapter 8. The Widow's Tears. The fog had begun to dissipate by the time Holmes and Watson made their way back to Baker Street. It was a strange quiet that had settled over the city, as if the very air was holding its breath after the storm of the previous night. They had faced the society that had played a part in Arthur Ashford's death. And though they had made significant progress in unraveling its secrets, the true extent of the conspiracy remained elusive. Holmes had always been one to take the long view, and while their most recent battle had been won, the war against the shadows that had claimed Ashford's life was far from over. As they entered their familiar office, Watson couldn't help but notice the change in Holmes. Though he had remained outwardly calm throughout the confrontation, there was a weariness in his eyes that had not been there before. The weight of the case, the knowledge that they had yet to unmask the full extent of the conspiracy, was beginning to take its toll on the great detective. And Watson, ever the observant companion, knew that even Holmes could not remain immune to the pull of exhaustion and doubt. Holmes stood by the window, his gaze distant, as the final remnants of the fog began to lift. His mind was already calculating, working through the myriad possibilities that lay ahead. But there was something in the air today that felt different, something that spoke of finality. "Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "We have uncovered many truths, but there are still so many questions left unanswered. Arthur Ashford's death was not merely the result of a betrayal, it was a carefully orchestrated act designed to send a message. But the question remains: who was the true target, and why? Watson could sense the underlying frustration in his friend's words, but he also knew that Holmes would not rest until every piece of the puzzle was in place. "And Mrs. Ashford?" Watson asked gently. "What about her? She must be beside herself with grief." Holmes turned away from the window, his eyes meeting Watson's with a somber expression. "Mrs. Ashford is part of this, Watson. Her involvement, though indirect, is critical to understanding the larger picture. But she is also a victim in all of this, and I fear that she may be in greater danger than she realizes." That afternoon, they returned to the Ashford residence, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the dangers that still loomed over the widow. Mrs. Ashford greeted them at the door, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. The grief that had once consumed her seemed to have deepened, as though the weight of her husband's death had been compounded by something else, something she could not yet comprehend. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know where to turn. I've been having dreams, terrible dreams. It's as if Arthur is still here, speaking to me, calling to me from beyond the grave." Holmes stepped forward, his expression gentle but filled with an undeniable urgency. "Mrs. Ashford, I believe your dreams are more than just the product of grief. They are a message, one that we need to decode. But first, I need you to tell me everything you've been experiencing, every detail." She led them to the sitting room, her movements slow and hesitant, as though each step was a reminder of the loss she had suffered. As they sat, Mrs. Ashford recounted the strange occurrences that had taken place since her husband's death, the whispers she had heard late at night, the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and the sense of someone watching her from the shadows. "I thought it was just my imagination," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But it's so real, Mr. Holmes, and there are moments when I feel like I'm being drawn into something I can't escape." Holmes listened intently, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Ashford as she spoke. "These dreams," he said carefully, "are not just the manifestation of your grief. They are connected to something much deeper, something tied to your husband's past, to the society that claimed his life. Mrs. Ashford's eyes widened. You mean the society? The ones who killed Arthur? Holmes nodded. Yes, but they are not done yet. I believe they are trying to send you a message. They want you to know that you are still a part of their game. And if you do not play by their rules, you will suffer the same fate as your husband. As Mrs. Ashford spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer across the floor. The flickering light from the fireplace cast strange shapes on the walls, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Holmes's mind was racing, his eyes darting around the room as though he could see the invisible forces that had haunted the widow. Mrs. Ashford, Holmes said softly, I need you to trust me. These dreams, these whispers, they are clues. The society you fear is trying to communicate with you, and I believe the key to stopping them lies in what you've experienced. I need you to recall every detail, no matter how small. She nodded, her face pale but determined. I'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Holmes. I can't bear this any longer. I need to know the truth. That night, as Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the weight of the case seemed heavier than ever. Mrs. Ashford's grief had been deepened by something far more sinister than a mere loss. It was as though she had become a part of the very darkness that had taken her husband's life. And yet, Holmes knew that her dreams, her experiences, were the key to unlocking the final piece of the puzzle. But there was something else. Something that had begun to gnaw at the edges of Holmes's mind, an unsettling feeling that he could not shake. The society that had been pulling the strings was not finished, not by a long shot. They had made one critical mistake in letting him get this far, but the danger had only escalated. They were not merely after Ashford's wealth or power. They were after something far more valuable. And Holmes knew that he was about to face a force that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. As the days passed, the tension between Holmes and Watson grew palpable. They had uncovered much, but there was still so much they did not know. The final confrontation was looming, and Holmes knew that it would take everything he had, every ounce of intellect, every ounce of determination, to unravel the web of deceit that had ensnared Arthur Ashford, and now threatened to consume Mrs. Ashford as well. In the quiet solitude of 221B Baker Street, as the fog continued to swirl outside, Holmes sat by the fire, lost in thought. Watson, ever the loyal companion, watched him from across the room, sensing that his friend was on the brink of some profound realization. Holmes, Watson said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. What are you thinking? Holmes looked up, his eyes intense, his mind racing. I'm thinking, Watson, that we are on the cusp of uncovering something that will change everything. But we must proceed with caution. The society we're dealing with is powerful, and they will not go down without a fight. As Holmes spoke, the door to the office creaked open, and Mrs. Ashford entered, her face filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice shaking, I've had another dream, but this time I saw him. Arthur was there, standing in the shadows. He said that the truth was buried in the past, that I must go back to the place where it all began. Holmes stood slowly, his eyes sharp with renewed purpose. Mrs. Ashford, I believe it is time for us to confront the past. The truth is within our reach, but we must go to the place where it all started. We must return to your husband's past and the dark secrets he left behind. Chapter 9. The final hour. The days following their conversation with Mrs. Ashford passed in a blur of investigation, reflection, and quiet resolve. The fog that hung over London seemed to mirror the heaviness that clung to Sherlock Holmes as he worked tirelessly to unravel the final threads of the case. There were no more distractions now, no more whispers in the shadows or veiled threats. The truth was finally within their grasp, but with it came the full weight of the danger that had shadowed Arthur Ashford's life, and now threatened Mrs. Ashford's as well. Holmes, though always composed, had begun to show subtle signs of wear. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, and his piercing gaze, which had once been razor-sharp, now seemed clouded with the complexity of the case. Watson had watched his friend closely and could see that the tension in Holmes's shoulders and the lines deepening on his forehead were not just the result of a challenging investigation. They were the marks of a man who was finally confronting the full scale of what had happened to Arthur Ashford and the forces that had killed him. Watson, as ever, stood by, offering support without question, though he too felt the impending sense of unease. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed to become. The atmosphere around them thickened, as though the very air in London had become laden with secrets, threatening to choke them with its weight. One evening, as they sat in their study at Baker Street, a sudden knock broke the silence. Mrs. Ashford, pale and fragile as ever, entered the room, her eyes wide with fear, her movements unsteady. She was holding a small envelope, its edges trembling in her hand. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I've received this letter. It was delivered by hand. It's addressed to me, but I don't understand it." Holmes stood immediately, his face going cold, as he took the letter from her. The paper was thick, high quality, much like the kind used for official correspondence. The seal was unfamiliar to Watson, but Holmes had no trouble recognizing it. It was the emblem of the very society they had been investigating, the dark force behind Ashford's death. Holmes broke the seal with careful precision and unfolded the letter. As he read, his face remained impassive, but Watson could see the subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of the shoulders, the narrowing of his eyes. This was no ordinary letter. It was a summons. Holmes looked up at Mrs. Ashford, his voice low, calm, but carrying the weight of the situation. "This letter is from them, the society. They know we are getting closer and they wish to meet. They want to end this." Mrs. Ashford's face went ashen, her hands trembling as she grasped the edge of the chair for support. What does it mean, Mr. Holmes? Will they come for me?" Holmes's eyes softened for a moment, though his voice remained steady. "I fear they already have, Mrs. Ashford. They are toying with you, trying to lure us into the open, but we will not fall into their trap. I will not let them harm you." Later that night, Holmes and Watson stood together, gazing out of the window at the dim lights of the city. The fog had returned, swirling through the streets in thick, suffocating tendrils. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the occasional muffled sound from the street below. Watson turned to Holmes, his face lined with concern. "Do you think it's time to confront them, to end this?" Holmes's expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something, perhaps regret, perhaps determination, in his eyes. "It is time, Watson. The society has orchestrated everything. The lies, the manipulation, the death of Arthur Ashford. They believe they control everything, that their secrets are safe. But they underestimate us. They do not realize how close we are to unraveling everything. He paused, then added in a quieter tone, "But there is one more thing we must do. One last piece of the puzzle." The following evening, Holmes and Watson arrived at the meeting place, the location indicated in the letter. It was a dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of London, its towering silhouette barely visible through the thick fog. The house, once grand and imposing, now stood as a hollow shell, its windows boarded up and its gates rusted shut. It felt as though the very building had given up hope, resigned to the dark secrets it housed within. Holmes and Watson stood in front of the gate, looking up at the mansion. The air was thick with foreboding, and despite the calmness Holmes exuded, Watson could feel the tension rising between them. They were walking into the lion's den, and both knew that the truth they sought would come at a great cost. "We know they're inside, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet, yet filled with purpose. "The time for secrecy is over. We are going to confront them, no matter what." As they approached the mansion, the door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. They entered, their footsteps echoing through the darkened halls, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift around them. Every corner of the house seemed to harbor a secret. Every wall whispered of a dark past. The silence was so oppressive that it felt as though the house itself was watching them. Holmes led the way, his mind sharp, his every sense on high alert. The air in the mansion felt colder, as if the warmth of life had been long extinguished. They moved down a narrow corridor, the walls lined with faded portraits, their eyes following them as they passed. At the end of the hall, they found a door, slightly ajar, beyond which they could hear faint voices, voices that seemed to hum with an energy that was at once unsettling and familiar. Holmes paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "This is it, Watson, the moment we've been waiting for." He pushed the door open, and the scene before them was nothing short of chilling. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few scattered candles. The figures standing around the room were cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden beneath hoods. There was no sign of the leader, the man they had been hunting for weeks. Instead, there was a different figure at the center of the room. A woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with fear, and though she stood tall, there was a sense of resignation about her. She was the one who had been pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated Arthur Ashford's death. Holmes's eyes locked with hers, and in that instant, a silent understanding passed between them. She knew they had come for her, and she knew there would be no escape. "You've made a terrible mistake," Holmes said, his voice low and steady, his words slicing through the tension in the room. The woman's lips curled into a bitter smile, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous, something that had been buried for far too long. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? You think you've uncovered the truth? The society is much older, much more powerful than you realize. And now, you've become part of it." She raised her hand, and in an instant, the shadows in the room shifted, as if they had a life of their own. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder, the tension more palpable than ever. Holmes stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "It's over. The truth will come to light, and you will face justice." And with those words, the room erupted into chaos. Yet for a brief moment, there was an overwhelming sense of clarity. The game was over. The society's power had crumbled, and with it, the last of the shadows that had consumed Arthur Ashford's life were finally being lifted. As they left the mansion, the fog had finally begun to lift. The silence that had hung over London for so long was broken, and Holmes felt the weight of the mystery lift from his shoulders. He turned to Watson, his eyes tired but resolute. "It's done, Watson. The truth is finally out. Mrs. Ashford will be free of the shadows that have haunted her." But even as Holmes spoke, Watson could see the flicker of something else in his eyes. A quiet recognition that, though this chapter had ended, the echoes of their pursuit would linger in his mind for some time. Chapter 10. A Quiet Resolution. The night after the final confrontation was strangely still. The fog that had so pervaded London for weeks had finally lifted, and a quiet calm settled over the city, as if the events of the past days had shifted the very atmosphere itself. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, and yet, despite the peaceful serenity, Sherlock Holmes felt no relief. The truth had been uncovered. Arthur Ashford's death, the dark society behind it, and the woman who had been pulling the strings were all exposed. And yet, for Holmes, the resolution felt both satisfying and incomplete. The investigation had been long, complex, and dangerous, with twists and turns that had stretched his mind to its limits. But now, standing in the dimming light of their office at 221B Baker Street, Holmes could not shake the feeling that there was something he had missed, something beyond the case itself, something that had eluded his keen eye. Dr. Watson, who had remained a steady presence throughout the investigation, sat in his usual chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, but his eyes were filled with the quiet concern that had become so familiar. Holmes, as always, was lost in thought, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he looked into the fire, its soft crackle the only sound in the room. "Holmes," Watson said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "The case is over. The truth has come to light. Mrs. Ashford can begin to heal, and the society that claimed her husband's life has been exposed. You've done it. You've brought justice." Holmes didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the fire, his mind racing through the final events of the case. The battle in the abandoned mansion, the confrontation with the woman at the center of it all. The danger that had hung over them for so long had dissipated, yet Holmes could not shake the quiet weight of it all. The case had ended, but something in him had shifted. A sense of finality lingered in the air, but it felt hollow. "I know, Watson," Holmes replied quietly, his voice distant. "But I cannot help feeling that there is still something unsettled. A part of me feels that, despite our success, something is missing." Watson leaned forward, studying his friend's face. He had known Holmes for long enough to recognize that the great detective's mind was never at ease, even when a case was closed. "What do you mean, Holmes?" "Everything is in its place now. The pieces have all fallen into place." Holmes finally turned to face Watson, his expression thoughtful, but tinged with something deeper, something that was more than mere exhaustion. "The case is over, yes, but the people we encountered, the ones who orchestrated Ashford's death, are not ordinary criminals. They were not motivated by greed or simple malice. There was something more to them, something almost idealistic in their pursuit of control, and that, Watson, is what troubles me." As Holmes spoke, Watson's gaze softened with understanding. He had seen his friend wrestle with cases of far more personal stakes, but this one had been different. It wasn't just the murder of one man, or even the betrayal of Arthur Ashford. It was the larger questions about power, control, and the nature of secret societies that had haunted Holmes since the beginning of the investigation. It was the questions that, even now, lingered in the back of his mind. "I see," Watson said, his voice gentle. "You're not just troubled by the outcome of the case, but by the larger implications of it. The way these shadowy figures sought to control everything from the shadows, using fear and manipulation as their tools." Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. "Yes, Watson. It is one thing to unmask a criminal, something I have done countless times. But it is another thing entirely to realize that these criminals were part of a much larger, more insidious network. A network that thrives on fear, secrecy, and control. And despite our success in uncovering them, there is a sense of dread that lingers. I wonder if we've truly stopped them, or if we've merely uncovered the smallest fraction of something much larger." The silence between them grew, thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Watson, ever the pragmatic one, knew that Holmes's mind was never fully at peace. But there was something different in his tone now, something that suggested Holmes was questioning not just the case, but the very nature of the world they lived in. And though Watson could never fully comprehend the depths of Holmes's intellect, he understood the man's heart. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "you've uncovered the truth. You've done what you do best. And as for the society that was behind Ashford's death, we've exposed them. They cannot operate in the shadows any longer." Holmes looked up at Watson, his expression softening for the first time in days. "You're right, Watson. And it is in this moment that I realize the importance of our work. For every mystery solved, for every criminal unmasked, there is something greater at play. We may not always see the full scope of our actions, but every truth uncovered brings us one step closer to understanding the world around us." The next morning, Mrs. Ashford arrived at Baker Street, her face a little less pale, her eyes carrying a flicker of hope. The shadows that had once clung to her seemed to have receded, and though the grief of losing her husband would never fully vanish, there was a sense of peace in her presence now. She carried with her the final documents, the letters from her late husband, his confessions, and the details of his involvement with the dark society that had taken his life. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "You have given me the truth. And with that truth, I can finally begin to move on." Holmes stood and nodded, his expression kind but distant, as though the weight of the case had not yet fully lifted from his shoulders. "It was not only my work, Mrs. Ashford. You, too, have played a crucial role in uncovering the truth. Without your willingness to share the details of your husband's life, we would never have come so far." Watson stepped forward, offering her a reassuring smile. "You've been through much, Mrs. Ashford, but now you can begin again. And though the road ahead may not be easy, know that the truth will always bring light in the end." Later that evening, as Holmes sat in front of the fire once more, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The case was finally over, and the truth had been uncovered. Mrs. Ashford would be free to rebuild her life and the shadow of the society that had manipulated her husband was no more. But for Holmes, the satisfaction of resolution was tempered by a quiet sense of unease. The truth, as always, was a double-edged sword. And though they had emerged victorious, there was a deep, unsettling awareness that the world they lived in was still full of shadows. Shadowy figures who lurked in places even Holmes's sharp eyes could not yet pierce. As he leaned back in his chair, his mind still processing the complexities of the case, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He had done what he always did. He had uncovered the truth. And in that moment, as the firelight danced in the room and the city outside remained still, Holmes felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The mystery was over, but the shadows that had once haunted Arthur Ashford and would now continue to haunt the world were never fully gone. The pursuit of truth was a journey without end,